The evening sun cast a golden glow over the quiet little diner nestled on the corner of a bustling street. Inside, the faint hum of conversation blended with the clatter of plates and the occasional hiss of the coffee machine. It was a place that had stood the test of time, a gathering spot where locals exchanged stories, travelers paused for a break, and life unfolded in its simplest moments. But today, the air inside felt different. The warmth seemed to falter, replaced by an unsettling chill that swept through the room. It began when a man walked in, a man whose quiet confidence was met with uneasy glances and whispered exchanges. He wasn't just any man, he carried himself with the grace of someone who had weathered storms, who understood the weight of the world's injustices and chose to meet them with dignity. The man scanned the room, his eyes landing on an empty booth near the window. As he moved toward it, the conversations around him softened, like ripples spreading in a still pond. A young waitress approached with a hesitant smile, her steps faltering when she caught the stern gaze of the manager, who stood near the counter. The manager's expression was hard, his jaw set, as though his very presence communicated a silent, unspoken rule. "I'm sorry," the waitress murmured, her voice barely audible as she turned to the man. "We're not serving right now." The man's eyebrows raised slightly, but he didn't argue. Instead, he looked around the room, where eyes quickly darted away. Some customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, others seemed to relish the tension, their expressions betraying quiet approval. The manager stepped forward, his voice sharp and cold. "I think it's best if you leave." For a moment, the man stood still, his gaze steady and calm, as though weighing the gravity of the situation. There was no anger in his expression, only a quiet strength that spoke volumes. He nodded once, turned, and walked toward the door, his footsteps echoing in the now silent diner. Outside, the streetlights flickered on, their glow cutting through the early evening shadows. The man paused at the edge of the sidewalk, taking a deep breath before walking away. He didn't look back, but inside the diner, the atmosphere was electric with tension. The manager, smug and self-assured, returned to his station, convinced he had done the right thing, or at least, what he believed was expected of him. But the story was far from over. As the man disappeared into the night, a chain of events was quietly set into motion, events that no one in that diner could have anticipated. Decisions made in the heat of prejudice would soon unravel in ways no one could have foreseen. The universe, it seemed, had a way of balancing the scales, and karma was about to strike in the most unexpected way. What happened next would challenge everything: people's beliefs, their actions, and the invisible rules that had governed the diner for years. And in the end, it would leave everyone wondering, could a single moment of cruelty truly change the course of so many lives? Stay tuned, because what happens next will take you on a journey you'll never forget. The next day, the diner buzzed with its usual morning crowd. The smell of sizzling bacon and freshly brewed coffee filled the air as regulars chatted about work, weather, and the little dramas of their lives. It was as if nothing had happened the night before, at least on the surface. But for those who had been there, the memory of that quiet man lingered, a shadow stretching over the small, familiar space. "I heard about what happened last night," one of the regulars muttered to the waitress pouring his coffee. "That guy, what was he even thinking, coming here?" The waitress, clearly uncomfortable, shrugged. "I don't know. He didn't seem like trouble to me." "Trouble has a way of showing up whether it looks like it or not," the man replied, his tone low but pointed. In the corner, an elderly woman shook her head, overhearing the conversation. "I don't see why he couldn't just eat like everyone else," she said softly. "It's not like he did anything wrong." The manager walked past at that moment, his expression stern. "Let's not dwell on it," he said firmly. "We have a business to run." But it wasn't so easy to ignore. That single moment had sparked whispers, debates, and even a quiet unease that no one wanted to acknowledge. Some customers returned to the diner with a sense of defiance, as if their presence was a statement of solidarity with the manager's actions. Others stayed away, feeling that something about the situation didn't sit right with them. Meanwhile, the man who had left the diner the night before hadn't disappeared entirely. He'd returned to his modest apartment on the other side of town, a place filled with books, photographs, and remnants of a life rich with experiences. His name was Michael, though few people in the diner had even bothered to learn it. Michael had grown used to moments like the one at the diner. They weren't new to him, and he didn't waste energy dwelling on the sting of rejection. Instead, he focused on what mattered: his work, his community, and the quiet fight for dignity that he carried with him everywhere he went. He spent the following morning at a local community center, where he volunteered as a mentor for young people navigating the challenges of a world that often felt stacked against them. The kids adored him, not just for his wisdom but for the way he listened to them, truly listened, as though their voices mattered just as much as anyone else's. "You always tell us to keep our heads high," a teenager named Jordan said, frowning as he recounted his own recent experience with discrimination. "But it's hard when people look at you like you don't belong." Michael nodded thoughtfully. "It is hard," he agreed. "But every time you hold your head high, you're reminding the world that you do belong. And someday, they'll have no choice but to see it." As the day went on, Michael couldn't help but think about the events at the diner. Not because they surprised him, they didn't, but because of what they represented. He knew he wasn't the first person to face that kind of treatment, and he wouldn't be the last. But what mattered to him was how people responded, not just him, but everyone who witnessed it. Back at the diner, the manager was busy with his usual routine, oblivious to the ripples of consequence that were beginning to form. A new customer walked in, a sharply dressed man with an air of authority that made the room take notice. He ordered a coffee and a slice of pie, sitting quietly at the counter as he observed the interactions around him. When the waitress brought his order, he asked her a question in a low voice. "I heard about what happened here last night. Is it true?" The waitress hesitated, glancing toward the manager before answering. "I don't know if it's my place to say," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The man smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Sometimes staying silent is just as loud as speaking up," he replied. The waitress didn't know what to make of his words, but they stayed with her long after he left the diner. What she didn't know was that the man wasn't just passing through, he was a journalist, and his quiet observation wasn't the end of his involvement. As the week went on, stories about the diner began to spread, starting as local gossip and growing into something larger. Someone had shared what they'd witnessed on social media, and the post had caught fire, igniting debates far beyond the small town. Some defended the diner, arguing that businesses had the right to refuse service. Others condemned the act, calling it a blatant example of prejudice that had no place in the modern world. Michael, for his part, remained calm as the story swirled around him. He hadn't sought attention, and he wasn't interested in becoming the center of a media storm. But he also knew that moments like this had the power to spark change if people were willing to face the uncomfortable truths they often tried to ignore. What no one could have predicted, however, was just how far the story would go, or how many lives it would touch along the way. As the tension grew, so did the stakes, and the question loomed larger than ever: would this moment lead to meaningful change, or would it simply fade away, another forgotten chapter in a long history of injustice? The answer was still unfolding, and the journey to get there was only just beginning. The story was no longer confined to the diner, or the quiet streets of the small town. As the days passed, the incident became a flashpoint for conversations far and wide. On social media, videos, photos, and posts dissected every angle of the story, often with exaggerated narratives. Some painted the diner as a relic of outdated values, while others championed it as a place where rules were rules. The truth, as always, was buried somewhere in the noise. In the town itself, lines began to divide where none had existed before. Longtime friends found themselves on opposite sides of the argument. A group of younger residents organized a peaceful protest outside the diner, holding handmade signs with messages like equality for all and dignity has no color. They stood in silence, their presence louder than any chant. Inside the diner, the manager grew increasingly agitated. Business had taken a hit, not enough to shut the doors, but enough to notice. Regular customers who once filled the booths were suddenly scarce, replaced by curious passers-by eager to catch a glimpse of the now infamous establishment. Some left without ordering, others stayed just long enough to complain about the unnecessary drama. The waitress, who had been there that night, felt the tension in every shift. She had never thought of herself as someone who'd take a stand. But the memory of the man's calm, steady gaze haunted her. She couldn't forget how his quiet dignity had contrasted so sharply with the way he'd been treated. She tried to voice her thoughts to the manager one morning, but he cut her off with a wave of his hand. "You're here to work, not to play moral referee," he snapped. "If you don't like how I run things, there's the door." She bit her lip and went back to pouring coffee, but the resentment simmered beneath her surface. Every day she stayed silent felt like complicity, and it was beginning to eat away at her. Meanwhile, Michael carried on with his life, though it was impossible to ignore the growing attention. People from the community began reaching out, some to offer support, others to vent their frustrations. At first, he tried to avoid the spotlight, but as the conversations grew louder, he realized he couldn't simply stand by. During a quiet evening at the community center, Michael gathered a small group of friends and colleagues to talk about the incident. Among them was Jordan, the teenager he had mentored, who had been deeply affected by what he'd seen unfold online. "Why don't we do something?" Jordan asked, his voice tinged with frustration. "It's not just about you, Mr. Michael. It's about everyone who's ever been treated like they don't belong." Michael leaned back in his chair, considering the boy's words. He knew Jordan was right. This wasn't just about him, it was about something much bigger. But how could they make an impact without adding to the chaos and anger already swirling around? "Sometimes, the best way to respond to hate is with understanding," Michael said finally. "We need to show people what dignity looks like, not just talk about it." The group brainstormed late into the night, coming up with plans for a community event that would bring people together. They envisioned an evening of shared stories, music, and food, a celebration of unity that would remind everyone of their shared humanity. As word of the event spread, it drew mixed reactions. Some in the town were eager to participate, while others dismissed it as a futile gesture. The diner's manager scoffed when he heard about it. "Another publicity stunt," he muttered to a regular customer. "They think they're gonna change the world with some kumbaya nonsense." But the tension wasn't just outside the diner. Behind the scenes, cracks were beginning to form among the staff. The waitress wasn't the only one questioning her place there. A cook, who had remained silent throughout the ordeal, started to wonder whether he could continue working for someone whose values clashed so starkly with his own. The journalist who had visited the diner weeks earlier was also working quietly behind the scenes. He had been digging into the manager's history, uncovering a trail of complaints and whispers about past incidents. None of it was enough to make headlines on its own, but together, it painted a picture of a man who had long operated on the edges of decency. As the day of the community event approached, the town seemed to hold its breath. The protest outside the diner continued, but the mood shifted from anger to anticipation. People who had been hesitant to take sides found themselves drawn into the conversation, questioning their own beliefs and assumptions. The manager, however, remained defiant. He doubled down on his stance, refusing to acknowledge any wrongdoing. In his mind, he was the victim of overreaction, of political correctness, of a world that no longer respected tradition. But as he sat alone in his office one night, staring at the dwindling sales numbers, a flicker of doubt crept in. He pushed it aside, determined to stand his ground. Yet deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that the world was changing in ways he couldn't control. And whether he liked it or not, those changes were coming straight to his doorstep. The community event was set to take place in a park just a few blocks from the diner. As the day drew closer, the tension in the air became almost palpable. Everyone knew something was about to happen, but no one could predict how it would unfold or what it would mean for the town, the diner, and the people at the heart of the story. On the day of the community event, the town seemed divided in two. One side was buzzing with excitement and hope, as people gathered at the park early to set up booths, hang colorful banners, and arrange chairs around a small stage. On the other side, the diner stood defiantly, its lights glowing dimly against the gray morning sky. Inside, the manager pretended to be unfazed, though the empty booths and quiet kitchen told a different story. The event began in the late afternoon, and people from all over the town started to trickle in. Some came out of curiosity, others with a genuine desire to be part of something bigger. The crowd was as diverse as the stories being shared on the stage. There were songs of resilience, spoken word performances about overcoming adversity, and heartfelt speeches from people who had faced discrimination and found strength in community. Michael stood near the edge of the gathering, watching with quiet pride as the event unfolded. He hadn't planned to speak, but several people approached him, encouraging him to share his story. At first, he hesitated, unsure if his voice would add anything to the powerful words already spoken. But as he looked around and saw faces young and old, hopeful and weary, he realized his story was just one thread in the larger fabric of change they were trying to weave. Meanwhile, back at the diner, the tension was unbearable. The waitress stood at the counter, watching the clock tick by, each second feeling heavier than the last. She had wanted to attend the event, but she couldn't bring herself to leave, not yet. The cook had already quit earlier that week, leaving the kitchen quieter than it had ever been. And the manager, sitting in his office, was trying to block out the sound of distant cheers drifting through the open window. As the sun began to set, the event reached its peak. The journalist who had quietly observed the town's dynamics stepped onto the stage and introduced Michael, calling him a man who represents the courage and grace we all aspire to. The crowd erupted into applause as Michael made his way to the microphone, his calm demeanor commanding attention. Michael took a deep breath and began to speak. He didn't focus on what had happened at the diner. Instead, he spoke about the importance of seeing each other as human beings. He shared stories from his own life, moments of pain, yes, but also moments of kindness that had restored his faith in people. His words were simple but powerful, and the crowd hung on to every one of them. But not everyone was in the park that evening. A small group of people had gathered outside the diner, not as protesters but as silent witnesses. They stood with signs that read, "Hope lives here and change starts with us," their quiet presence a stark contrast to the defiance that still lingered inside the building. The manager finally emerged from his office, unable to ignore the scene any longer. He looked out the window and saw the faces of people he had known for years, neighbors, former customers, even a childhood friend. Their expressions weren't angry or accusatory, they were resolute, as if they were waiting for something, though he didn't know what. Inside the diner, the waitress had reached her breaking point. She set down the pot of coffee she'd been holding and turned to the manager, her voice trembling but firm. "I can't do this anymore," she said. "You keep saying this place is about tradition, but what kind of tradition are we really standing for?" The manager didn't respond right away. For the first time, he looked genuinely shaken, his usual bravado cracking under the weight of her words. Before he could reply, a knock sounded at the door. It was one of the silent witnesses, a woman holding a small piece of paper. Reluctantly, the manager opened the door. The woman handed him the paper, a flyer for the event at the park. "You should come," she said softly. "It's not too late to be part of something good." The manager didn't answer, but the flyer trembled slightly in his hand. He glanced back at the waitress, who was now gathering her things to leave. The cook's empty station loomed in the background, a silent reminder of how much the diner had lost in the past weeks. At the park, Michael's speech was drawing to a close. He looked out at the crowd and said, "Change doesn't happen in big leaps. It happens in small steps, in moments when we choose to be better. It's not easy, but it's worth it." As the crowd erupted into cheers, the waitress arrived, slipping quietly into the back. She didn't want to interrupt, but she couldn't stay away any longer. She felt a sense of relief and belonging she hadn't experienced in weeks, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe things could get better. The manager stood alone in the diner, staring at the flyer in his hand. Outside, the group of witnesses remained, their presence unwavering. He felt a heaviness in his chest, a mix of shame, anger, and something else, something unfamiliar but undeniable. The sound of applause echoed faintly in the distance, growing louder in his mind until it was impossible to ignore. And as the evening sky turned to twilight, the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The manager remained rooted to the spot, staring at the flyer as though it held answers to questions he couldn't articulate. Outside, the group of witnesses lingered in the dim glow of the diner's lights, their quiet vigil unwavering. For the first time, he felt a crack in the armor he'd built over years of stubborn pride. But just as quickly as the doubt crept in, he shoved it aside. What good would it do now? The damage had been done, and there was no going back, or so he thought. At the park, the event was winding down, but the energy in the air remained electric. People lingered in small groups, exchanging stories and ideas. Michael stood near the stage, surrounded by a few close friends and community members who wanted to thank him for speaking. He was tired but also invigorated, the weight of the past weeks momentarily lifted by the collective hope around him. Then, a commotion stirred near the edge of the crowd. Heads turned as the journalist approached, flanked by two strangers both sharp-eyed, with an air of quiet authority. They made their way toward Michael, who greeted them with a curious but welcoming smile. "Michael," the journalist began, his tone serious but measured, "these are investigators from the Regional Human Rights Commission. They've been looking into some things, and they'd like to talk to you." Michael's brow furrowed. "Investigators?" he repeated, glancing between the two newcomers. "I'm not sure what I can help with." One of the investigators stepped forward. "We've been following reports of discriminatory practices at certain establishments in the area," she explained. "Your story isn't the first we've heard about this diner, and we believe it may be part of a larger pattern. We'd like to know more about what happened that night, if you're willing to share." Michael hesitated. He hadn't sought out this kind of attention, and the idea of turning a personal experience into a formal investigation made him uneasy. But before he could respond, Jordan appeared at his side, his young face alight with determination. "You should do it," Jordan said, his voice firm. "It's not just about you. It's about all of us." The words struck a chord, and Michael nodded slowly. "All right," he said, addressing the investigators. "I'll tell you what I know." As Michael began recounting the events of that night, the tension in the park grew. People gathered closer, their murmurs a mix of curiosity and concern. It was clear that the story had reached a turning point, one that could have far-reaching consequences. Meanwhile, back at the diner, the manager's night took an unexpected turn. Just as he was about to lock up and leave, a car pulled into the nearly empty parking lot. A man stepped out, a face the manager recognized instantly, though he hadn't seen him in years. It was an old acquaintance, someone from a chapter of his life he rarely spoke about. The man strode inside, his expression a mix of urgency and frustration. "We need to talk," the visitor said without preamble. The manager stiffened. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. "I haven't seen you in years." "That's exactly why I'm here," the man replied. "I've been hearing things about this place, about you. And let me tell you, it doesn't look good. You think this is all just going to blow over? You're wrong." The conversation that followed was tense, filled with accusations, denials, and long-buried grievances. The visitor revealed that he, too, had once faced a moment of reckoning, one that forced him to confront his own biases and make a choice about the kind of person he wanted to be. He had come to the diner not to lecture but to offer the manager a chance to do the same. "You've got a choice," the visitor said finally, his voice heavy with meaning. "You can double down and let this place crumble around you, or you can own up to your mistakes and start making it right. But let me warn you, if you think the world's going to forget, you're kidding yourself." The words lingered long after the visitor left, leaving the manager alone with his thoughts. For the first time, he began to see the threads connecting his actions to the larger consequences unfolding around him. But seeing was one thing, acting was another. Back at the park, the investigators finished their discussion with Michael and quietly slipped away to continue their work. The crowd began to thin, but the conversations didn't stop. People exchanged phone numbers, made plans to meet again, and promised to keep the momentum alive. It was a night of unity, but also a night of unresolved tension, as everyone waited to see what would come next. As Michael walked home under the soft glow of streetlights, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still brewing. He didn't know what it was, but he could sense it, a storm gathering on the horizon, ready to push everything to its breaking point. And though he didn't know how it would end, he was ready to face whatever came next. The following morning, the diner opened to an unusual stillness. The manager, weary from the events of the previous night, tried to focus on his routine, checking the inventory, setting up the tables, and flipping the sign to open. But something felt different. The usual hum of activity outside was absent, replaced by a quiet tension that seemed to hang in the air. He wasn't prepared for what happened next. A group of community members, including some of the protesters who had been stationed outside the diner for weeks, approached the building. This time, though, they weren't holding signs or standing in silent protest. They entered the diner as customers, calmly taking seats at the booths and counters. The waitress, who had decided to work one last shift before quitting for good, froze in surprise. The manager watched from behind the counter, unsure of what to make of it. Among the group was Michael, his steady presence impossible to ignore. He walked in last, taking a seat near the window where the morning light streamed in. His expression was calm, but there was a quiet resolve in his eyes. The other customers, regulars and newcomers alike, watched in silence, sensing that something significant was unfolding. The waitress, feeling the weight of the moment, stepped forward to take Michael's order. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the notepad, but she met his gaze with an expression of quiet solidarity. "What can I get for you?" she asked softly. "Just a coffee, please," Michael replied, his voice steady. The manager, watching the exchange from a distance, felt a knot tighten in his chest. He wanted to intervene, to assert control over the situation, but something held him back. The sight of Michael sitting there, so composed and unwavering, stirred a mix of emotions he couldn't fully untangle: anger, shame, and something dangerously close to regret. As the morning wore on, more people arrived at the diner. Some were there to support Michael, others simply curious to witness what was happening. The atmosphere was tense but respectful, a delicate balance that everyone seemed determined to maintain. Then, just as the diner began to feel like a pressure cooker about to explode, the door opened once more. The two investigators from the Human Rights Commission entered, their expression serious but non-confrontational. They approached the counter and asked to speak with the manager privately. The room fell silent as the manager reluctantly led them to the back office. For what felt like an eternity, the muffled sound of voices drifted through the closed door. The customers exchanged nervous glances, and the waitress tried to stay focused on her work, though her hands shook with every cup of coffee she poured. When the manager finally emerged, his face was pale, his usual bluster replaced by a quiet, almost resigned demeanor. He walked to the middle of the diner, where Michael was sitting, and cleared his throat. The manager began, his voice cracking slightly. He paused, glancing around at the crowd before settling his gaze on Michael. "I owe you an apology. For what happened that night. For how you were treated. It wasn't right. The room went still. For a moment, it seemed as though time itself had stopped. Then, Michael nodded, his expression unreadable. "Thank you," he said simply. But before anyone could take a breath of relief, one of the investigators stepped forward. "While we appreciate the apology," she said, her tone firm, "there are still matters to address. Our investigation has uncovered a pattern of discriminatory practices here, and there will be consequences." The manager's face tightened, but he didn't argue. He nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping under the weight of the words. The investigators left soon after, leaving the diner in a strange, fragile silence. As the crowd began to disperse, Michael stood up to leave. He paused at the door, turning back to look at the manager one last time. "Change is hard," he said quietly. "But it's never too late to do the right thing." With that, he walked out, the sunlight catching the edge of his silhouette as he disappeared down the street. The manager watched him go, the weight of his words lingering long after the door swung shut. In the weeks that followed, the diner underwent significant changes. The manager announced that he would step down, leaving the business in the hands of a new owner, someone with a vision for creating a welcoming space for everyone. The waitress, inspired by the courage she had witnessed, decided to stay, becoming an integral part of the diner's transformation. Michael, meanwhile, continued his work at the community center, quietly leading by example and fostering conversations that bridged divides. The town, once fractured by the incident, began to heal, its people finding common ground in their shared humanity. But the final twist came when the journalist's article about the diner and the community event went viral, drawing national attention to the small town. Donations poured in for the community center, and Michael was invited to speak at conferences and events across the country. Though he remained humble, he couldn't ignore the ripple effect of his actions, a testament to the power of standing up for what's right, even in the face of adversity. And in the corner of a quiet diner, under new management and a new sense of purpose, a plaque was mounted on the wall. It read simply, "A place for everyone." In the months that followed, the town found itself in a state of transformation, not just in its buildings or businesses, but in the way its people began to see one another. The incident at the diner had shaken the community to its core, forcing conversations that many had avoided for years. It wasn't easy, change never is. But slowly, the fabric of the town began to mend, one thread at a time. The new owner of the diner, a woman who had spent years working in hospitality, brought a fresh perspective and a genuine desire to create a welcoming space. She hired a diverse staff, including some young people from the community who had never felt they had a place in such an establishment. The menu remained familiar comfort food that people loved, but the atmosphere was different. The old tensions were replaced by warmth and inclusivity. Customers began to return, not just for the food but for the sense of belonging they felt the moment they walked through the door. Michael continued his quiet work at the community center, focusing on programs that brought people together. Whether it was through art workshops, sports leagues, or storytelling nights, he found ways to help others share their experiences and listen to one another. He didn't seek out the attention his story had garnered, but when opportunities arose to speak about the importance of empathy and understanding, he accepted them with humility. His words resonated far beyond the town, inspiring people in other communities to start their own conversations about inclusion and respect. Jordan, the young man who had stood up that night at the diner, became an active volunteer at the community center. He found a mentor in Michael and discovered a passion for advocacy. With Michael's encouragement, Jordan applied to a nearby university, where he planned to study social work. His experience at the diner had been a turning point, and he was determined to use it as a foundation for creating positive change. The waitress, who had once felt trapped in her job, found a renewed sense of purpose. She stayed at the diner not because she had to, but because she wanted to be part of its transformation. She became a friendly, familiar face to customers, always quick with a kind word or a warm smile. Over time, she realized that her small acts of kindness were as important as any grand gesture in making people feel valued. As for the former manager, his departure from the diner marked the beginning of a long journey of self-reflection. For weeks after stepping down, he kept to himself, grappling with the weight of his choices and the harm they had caused. But one day, he showed up at the community center, uncertain of how he would be received. Michael greeted him with the same calm, steady demeanor he had shown that night in the diner. The conversation was brief but meaningful. The manager didn't expect forgiveness, but he expressed a genuine desire to learn and to make amends. Michael encouraged him to start by really listening to the people around him. It wasn't an easy process, but over time, the former manager began to engage with the community in small, meaningful ways. He volunteered at the local food bank, attended town hall meetings, and participated in discussions that challenged his perspectives. Slowly, he began to rebuild trust, one relationship at a time. The journalist who had first brought attention to story continued to follow its developments, documenting the town's progress in a series of articles. The pieces weren't just about the diner or Michael's speech, they were about the ripple effects of one act of courage. Readers from across the country were inspired by the town's journey, finding parallels in their own communities and taking steps to foster change where they lived. One evening, nearly a year after the incident at the diner, the community center hosted a special event to celebrate the progress the town had made. The park was once again filled with laughter and music, the stage adorned with lights and flowers. People of all ages and backgrounds came together, sharing food, stories, and moments of connection. Michael was asked to say a few words, but he kept his speech brief. He didn't dwell on the past or his role in what had happened. Instead, he focused on the future, emphasizing the importance of continuing the work they had started. "This isn't the end of the story," he said. "It's just the beginning. Change isn't something we achieve once and move on from, it's something we choose every day." As the crowd applauded, Michael looked out at the faces before him. There was Jordan, beaming with pride as he stood beside his family. There was the waitress, laughing with a group of her coworkers. There was the new owner of the diner, chatting with customers who had become friends. And there, standing quietly at the edge of the crowd, was the former manager, his expression one of quiet humility. The event stretched late into the night, the glow of string lights casting a warm, golden hue over the park. As people began to pack up and head home, Michael lingered for a moment, taking it all in. He didn't know what challenges lay ahead, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a deep sense of hope. The next day, life in the town returned to its usual rhythm, but the echoes of that night and the journey that had led to it remained. The diner continued to thrive, not just as a business but as a symbol of what the town had become. The community center expanded its programs, welcoming more people than ever before. And the conversations that had started in the wake of the incident never stopped, evolving and deepening as the town grew stronger together. The story of the diner, the town, and the people who had come together to create change became more than just a local tale. It was a reminder that even in the face of division and adversity, there is always a path forward. It starts with listening, with understanding, and with the courage to take that first, small step towards something better.